So I've published, I think, more than 10 books at this point. And so it's been one or two a year for the last, I don't know, 10 years, something like that. And I say over 12 because there have been various manuscripts that I just turn into PDF files and don't bother actually physically printing. But I think there are 10 books that have been physically printed. And so my evolution around this was a couple of things. First of all, a number of people said that talking with me was very interesting and they'd never had that kind of conversation or met anyone else like me before. But of course, I've met me before and I've had that conversation before. And so one strain of book writing was, I don't want to have the whole conversation for you, and then for you, and then for you, and then for you, and you, just because you haven't had it. I've had it now 10 times. It's not growing for me anymore. It's just interesting for you. So if I write a book, then if someone's interested in that, and I've already talked about all that, then I can say, okay, well, read it in the book. And so I don't like rejecting people. And so if someone wants to talk about something and I'm really not interested in having that conversation, I don't like just saying, fine, there's no one else you can talk with about this in your life. I get it, but I don't care and I'm not going to talk about it. I can say, okay, I get that, but I've written it all down for you. Here it is. So that's one drive. The other thing is that I have a very active mind. And what I've learned is that stuff comes in and then it goes out again. And I forget what came in and came out again unless I slow it down and track it in some way. Now, I find writing a book as things are coming in and going out is a great way to slow it down enough so that I'll remember it. And so that's, an aspect. Thirdly, when I write something down, it expands, because I'm really focusing on it and putting it into language. And the same happens with a video. I get a little second thought and I can think all of it in a second, but it's a little bit fuzzy. By the time I've expanded that fuzzy idea for a second into a whole hour of language, now it's really crisp and it's much more objectified. I can then start relating to it as an observer. And so there's that process of expanding consciousness. Fourth, in order to integrate something and really learn it, one of the best ways to approach that is to teach it. And so in that sense, to really teach something phenomenal. To really learn something phenomenally, teach it adequately. And so that's generally been approached. So as I get an idea, I'll often sit down and try and teach it to someone else. And then the student in me is listening and trying to learn what I'm teaching. So that's another thing. Now, the sixth part is I know that 80% of my ideas are good ideas. And that's a good enough statistic. It's well above average, and so, meaning 50-50 would be average. So I wouldn't pay much attention to myself if half of my ideas were good and half of them weren't. But 80% of my ideas generally bring an improvement in well-being. So what I've learned is that most people in the United States do not want to be taught something. Because there's a low social ranking associated with learning. For some reason in our culture, we say that if you're teaching, you think you're better than, and that if the learner, if they accept that they have something to learn, then somehow they're less than. So this is part of our cultural chauvinism. And so in America, there's lots of people giving advice, and there's lots of people resisting receiving advice. And I'm just the opposite. I love learning from a great, teacher. I don't like people telling me stuff when they haven't bothered to learn enough about me so that their advice is relevant. But I've come to peace with the fact that if I do understand something and give some advice, that 90% of Americans are going to do absolutely nothing with it. And that's kind of a waste of time. You know, of course, the joy of giving advice is to watch someone's life blossom and change. And so what I've done is I generally pivot that advice giving towards a book. Now, when I give advice in the abstract or detail in a book or share something I'm learning, when I finish the chapter, I often take my own advice and my life gets better. And that's good enough. Meaning, if I say, gee, you could benefit from that, you could benefit from that, and you could benefit from that, and all three people do absolutely nothing with it, which happens a fair amount of the time. If I take those three bits of advice and apply them in my own life, and my own life gets a lot better, then it's not wasted advice, because at least one person has taken it. And I've learned that the way my brain works is it's easiest to give advice trying to help someone else, but that I'm the most likely person to apply my own advice. And once I've given the advice to someone else, I'm often going to take my own advice, and my life gets better at 85% of the time, or more when I do so. And I'm quite happy with that. And so it's like, if you don't want to take my advice, fine, at least my life will get better. But that again pushes me more towards books, because when 90% of Americans, the people I'm mostly around, are not going to do anything with the advice, do I really want to take 1, 2, 3 hours to explain a piece of advice and then they just go off and do absolutely nothing with it? I don't. But it's $3 to print a book. Here, have a book. If you want to ignore it, it's just $3. I haven't wasted any of my time. And so that's, an aspect of that. I also think that reading good books is intelligent. And so if I give a book to someone and they do something intelligent with it, they've just told me they're an intelligent person in my language, meaning that's one way I filter intelligence. They've also told me that they're receptive to some of my paradigms, that we're compatible in some of those areas. And if they're grateful, they've told me they're a grateful person. And if they want to connect, it tells me that they've seen some things about me that they can connect with. So that's a useful part of writing a book. And another thing that happens when I'm writing a book is a certain kind of channeling. Meaning, very often when I'm making a video or writing a chapter, I sit down and just type away, and the hands just kind of do their thing. And I look and say, gee, that's interesting. I hadn't quite thought about that, and that's right, and and it's kind of like creating art. And so it's very enjoyable for me to, witness that this beautiful flow of energy just coming through in a nice form. I generally try and write books that I would want to read, that I want to write, and that don't quite exist in that arena. That's a useful and fun, thing for me to do. And one of my greatest joys is hearing when someone does benefit from the book or is awakened and enjoys that. I read the statistics which said that 99% of all self-published authors lose money because they'll get these book packages where they'll hire an editor for $3,000 or $5,000, and they'll have a $800 book cover and this and that, and then the average book of a self-published author sells 100 copies. So those are the statistics. That's the house. And I don't like betting against huge statistics like that. I mean, it's incredibly arrogant, in my opinion, to say 99% of all self-published authors lose money because they spend $6,000 to $10,000 producing their book and they sell 100 copies. But I'm somehow going to always be different. I'm going to be in that 1%. It just seems irrational. And so my assumption is that my books will sell 100 copies. That's what 99% of books sell, if they're self. And my assumption is that they're not going to make me any money, that they're going to cost me money. But I reduce the cost by editing them myself or having friends edit them, by making the covers myself or going on to Fiverr.com and having the beginning of a book cover developed for $5. And then I publish them on CreateSpace in Amazon, which is free, and I print on demand, so I don't have, garage fulls of books. And that's pretty much what happens. I don't know, over time, certain books may get more, or if I go through a wave of popularity around something, maybe there'll be a surge, but then people can order those books. And I like to just keep a book going, like right now the book I'm writing is about Marin homelessness. There is no book, and there probably will never be another book on Marin homelessness, my county and the homeless patterns in local government, et cetera, et cetera. So I do various editions as well. So I might do a first edition, read it a year later, and then say, oh, I'll add a few chapters and do a second edition. Just sit down, write the chapters, publish it again as a second edition. That type of organic flow gives immediate gratification. And I've learned that I can't and don't enjoy creating this huge architecture for a book and then fitting myself into the architecture. Rather, I pick a title, I pick a theme, and as ideas pop into my head, I pick the title and theme that's interesting to me at the time, so then I'll be thinking about it. And then as ideas pop into my head, I will sit down and write them down. And my goal is always to complete a chapter with a sitting, because otherwise, by the time I sit down to complete the chapter, I'll have a slightly different version and the whole thing has to be rewritten. And if I don't finish that, then by the next time I sit down, there'll be another version of the chapter and the whole thing will have to get rewritten. So then it's never done. And so by breaking things into like 30 to 60 minute chunks for chapter sizes, and then completing the chapter, usually there's very minimal editing at this point in my writing career that needs to be done. But if when I read it a year later, I notice it, I'll mark it up and just change the document and Bing republish it. And so that's been my relationship with writing books. In the process, I've never lost any money. In fact, by publishing 2 local landscape books just from my county, I've actually made hundreds of thousands of dollars, not by selling books, but by people reading the books, enjoying the books, and then hiring me to design and install their landscapes.